Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
The wine glass slipped from her fingers before she fully understood what she had heard. It did not shatter. She caught it, one hand snapping out in the dark, with a precision born from 4 years of carrying crystal across uneven stone floors in the half-light behind heavy curtains. She caught the glass and held it against her chest and stood completely still, pressed into the space between the velvet drape and the cold wall, and did not breathe. On the other side of the curtain, two men continued talking in voices low enough to be almost nothing. Almost. Linna Voss had very good ears. She had always kept that fact to herself. It had taken her until the age of 19 to understand that a servant's greatest tool was not speed or strength or a memory for orders. It was the ability to be so thoroughly unremarkable that the people in the room forgot she was there. And when people forgot you were there, they said things. Not always interesting things. Not usually things that mattered, but sometimes, rarely, once in 4 years of carrying plates and refilling goblets and moving through great halls like water, finding the cracks in stone, you heard something that changed everything. She was 22 years old. She worked the banquet hall and the private dining rooms of Ildmar Keep, the seat of Alpha King Kael Marin, sovereign of the Northern Territories and acknowledged ruler of the 7 Packs. She had worked here since she was 18, brought in as part of a household intake after the previous serving staff was reorganized, following a change in the head steward. She had no pack of her own. Her mother had been a low-ranking Omega from a dissolved line. Her father was a name she had never been given. She carried plates for a living, and she was very good at it. And she had long ago made peace with the understanding that this was the shape of her life. She was nobody. The two men on the other side of the curtain did not know she was there. That was the detail that was going to matter. The council supper had been running for 2 hours. Lord Brennan of the Ashwick Territories and Lord Vars of the Coastal Federation were seated at the far end of the long table, with 4 other pack lords, eating the 3rd course of a 7-course meal that Linna and the other servants had been preparing and serving for 11 days in advance. Tonight was the signing of the Eldmar Pact, the formal agreement between the Northern Crown and its 6 sworn territories that would bind trade routes, military obligations, and succession rights for the next 50 years. It was the most significant political event in 3 generations. Linna had been assigned the wine service for the private alcove at the east end of the room, the recessed section behind the heavy curtain where secondary guests gathered between courses, where advisors leaned toward one another and spoke quietly, where the important words were never the ones spoken at the main table. She had heard that said once by the head steward, and had stored it the way she stored useful things. She had gone behind the curtain to retrieve an empty decanter. She had heard Lord Brennan say the word poison. She had stopped. She had not made a sound. Now she stood in the narrow space behind the curtain, with the retrieved glass pressed to her chest, and listened to Lord Brennan explain to Lord Vars that the wine in the king's goblet for the final toast had been treated, not with something that killed. Brennan was very specific about this. He repeated it twice, as though the precision was important to him, as though it absolved him of something. Not death. Something more useful than death. A compound extracted from the root of the silverbark plant that grew only in the deep Ashwick forests, which Brennan's family had controlled for 4 generations. A compound that, when consumed, suppressed the alpha command structure in the brain for a period of 48 hours. It did not harm the body. It did not cause pain. It simply made the one who drank it extraordinarily susceptible to suggestion, to direction, to the carefully worded influence of those who knew what they were doing. 48 hours of a king who could not refuse. Long enough for the pact to be rewritten. Long enough for 3 territorial concessions to be quietly amended. Long enough for the border adjustments that had been rejected twice in open council to be approved by a hand holding a pen, guided by men who had arranged this evening very carefully and over a very long time. Vars asked how the compound had been introduced to the wine. Brennan said his steward had handled the specific goblet an hour ago. Vars asked when the toast would be called. Brennan said 4 minutes, once the 6th course was cleared. Linna counted. She was holding her breath and counting, and the number she arrived at was not 4 minutes to do something. It was 4 minutes to decide whether she was the kind of person who did anything at all. She had no rank. She had no authority. She had no weapon. She was a woman in a gray uniform holding an empty wine decanter behind a curtain in a room full of lords and warriors and the Alpha King himself. And if she stepped out from behind that curtain and said what she had heard, there was no reason in the world why anyone would believe her over Lord Brennan of the Ashwick territories. She thought about that very clearly and very briefly. Then she thought about something else. She knew this room. She had worked this room for 11 days in preparation for this evening alone, and for 2 years before that in the regular service rotation. She knew where the secondary wine service table stood. She knew which bottles were which. She knew the precise color and weight of the goblets that had been assigned to each seat, because she had polished every single one of them herself 3 days ago, and arranged them on their trays, in the order they would be carried out for the toast. The king's goblet was the tallest, the one with the thin gold rim that caught the candlelight differently from the others. She had noticed it when she set the trays. She also knew something that Lord Brennan, who had been in this room for the first time tonight, did not know. The service table for the toast tray was 7 feet from the edge of the curtain. She was already behind the curtain. She did not think about it any further. She moved. Not fast, because fast made noise. Slow and deliberate, the way she moved through crowded rooms when she did not want to be seen, the way she had been moving through rooms for 4 years. She lifted the curtain edge by 2 inches and stepped through it in the same motion that she would use to walk back to the service station. No hesitation, no changed posture. A servant returning from a task, nothing more. The council room was warm with candlelight and the smell of roasted meat and the particular undertone of old stone that she had stopped noticing years ago. The main table ran the length of the room, and all 6 lords were seated at it, the king at the head. His back was to her. The toast tray was on the secondary service table to her left, exactly where she had left it 2 hours ago. 7 goblets in a row. The one with the gold rim was the 3rd from the left. She did not look at the curtain behind her. She did not look at Brennan. She walked to the service table with the empty decanter in one hand and set it down in its designated position among the other empties. And while she did, her other hand moved to the tray. There was a strict protocol for how the toast goblets were arranged. Position, distance from tray edge, handle angle. She had memorized it because she memorized protocols. That was part of her job. She also knew that Lord Vars, who was seated at the far end of the table, had a goblet that was nearly identical to the king's in height. The difference was the gold rim. Vars's was plain silver. She had one hand on the tray. She needed to swap those two goblets, and she needed to do it without touching the liquid inside, without making any sound, and without any of the 6 lords or the king or the 4 guards, positioned at the room's corners, seeing what she was doing. She had one advantage. The guards were watching the doors, as guards did. The lords were seated facing the main table, engaged in the close of the 6th course. The king's back was to her. The head steward was at the far end of the room near the wine cabinet. She picked up the tray and carried it toward the east side cabinet, as though she were repositioning it for the toast service. That was a reasonable thing for a server to do. It was exactly the kind of preparation move that happened in the 10 minutes before a toast. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever looked at her. At the cabinet, with her back to the room, she moved the goblets. It took 4 seconds. The plain silver one went to the king's position. The gold-rimmed one went to Vars's position. She turned around and carried the tray back to the service table. She set it down exactly as she had found it. She picked up the empty decanter again. She walked back toward the service corridor door. Behind her, she heard the head steward's voice call out the beginning of the toast sequence. She did not stop walking. She did not look back. She went through the service door and stood in the corridor outside, and pressed her back against the cold stone wall, and breathed for the first time in what felt like several minutes. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that with something like distant surprise. Her hands were perfectly steady, the way they always were when she was working. On the other side of the door, she heard the sound of chairs shifting as the lords rose for the toast. She heard the head steward's formal words. She heard the brief, charged silence that preceded a toast. She heard the sound of crystal raised and lowered, and then she heard nothing unusual. That was the thing about this kind of poison. It worked slowly, according to what Brennan had said. It did not cause a scene. It did not cause collapse. It simply settled into the blood over the course of an hour, and began its quiet work of making a king into something a man could move. Which meant she would not know, standing in the corridor, whether she had swapped the right goblets. She would not know for an hour. She went back to work. Clear's throat. There was nothing else to do. She was a server. The 6th course needed to be cleared, and the dessert course needed to be carried out, and the secondary wine decanters needed to be refilled for the informal conversation period that would follow the signing. She did her job. She moved through the room with the same unhurried efficiency that had made her invisible for 4 years. She cleared plates. She refilled glasses. She did not look at Lord Brennan, who was speaking to a neighboring lord, with the careful animation of a man who was watching a clock inside his chest. She watched the king. She was not obvious about it. She had spent 4 years learning not to be obvious about anything, but in the spaces between tasks, in the moments when she crossed the room with a tray, or repositioned herself near the service wall. She watched Cale Marin. He was not a man who was easy to look away from, which she had also stored as a useful piece of information, and never discussed with anyone. He was 31. She knew this, because the household staff knew the king's age, the way they knew the capacity of the wine cellars, and the weight limit of the eastern staircase, as practical operating knowledge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in a way that was not remarkable among the Alpha Lords, but that carried a different quality. something in the way he held himself that made the space around him seem arranged rather than incidental. He had dark hair, worn short, and pale eyes that she had only seen from a distance and had always managed to avoid. He spoke rarely at formal dinners. When he did, the room changed pitch. Tonight, he spoke for the signing. He rose at the appropriate moment and spoke clearly about obligations, about the weight of covenant, about what it meant to bind 7 generations of wolves into a common future. It was not a performance. That was the thing about it. She had heard speeches at formal dinners before, and she knew the quality of practiced words assembled to sound true. This was different. It was the speech of a man who had thought carefully about what he believed and was saying it. Linna cleared the dessert course from the far end of the table and did not think about the fact that she had possibly just swapped the wrong goblets, and that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was currently standing with a glass that had been prepared for him specifically, and that she had almost certainly made a terrible mistake. She cleared the dessert course and refilled a decanter and arranged the service station for the informal period. The signing happened. 7 lords pressed their marks to the parchment in order of territorial seniority. The head steward recorded each one with a formal notation. The king signed last, with a pen that he held with the particular ease of a man who had signed his name to many consequential things. And then the formal portion ended, and the lords began to move and speak freely, and Linna waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. The informal period ran for 45 minutes. Lords spoke. Wine was poured. 2 of the visiting lords requested a tour of the northern gallery, which the head steward arranged. Lord Brennan remained at the table, speaking to Vars in a voice too low to hear. The king moved between groups, with the measured deliberateness of a man who was doing his job, and he seemed entirely himself, and nothing was wrong. Linna began to wonder whether she had imagined what she heard. She began to wonder whether she had heard it correctly, whether the compound Brennan described was real, whether any of this was real, and she was a woman who had been standing in a dim corridor too long, and misheard 2 lords discussing the vintages of the Ashwick territories. She cleared the final dessert glasses from the secondary table and carried them on a tray toward the corridor door. She was almost through it when she heard Lord Vars's voice, louder than it had been all evening, carrying across the room in a tone she recognized without being able to name it. The tone of a man trying to cover a crack. He was saying something was wrong with him. Something was not right. He was asking for water. His voice had a strange quality to it, a thickness, and when she turned briefly in the doorway, she saw that Vars was seated when the other lords were standing, and his hand on the table was not quite steady, and his eyes had an unfocused quality that was new. Lord Brennan was looking at Vars, and then Brennan looked up, and looked directly at Linna, not at the space around her, not at the tray she was carrying, at her, with an expression that she understood completely, and that had no name she wanted to give it. She held the tray. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and walked through the door into the service corridor, and closed it behind her with the precise, quiet click of a servant who knows how to close doors. Clear's throat. If you have stayed with this story this far, you already know that it does not end in that corridor. You already know that Linna walking away was not the same as Linna disappearing. Subscribe to this channel now, because what happens next is the part nobody saw coming, and we are only at the beginning of it. Clears throat. She did not go to the servants' quarters. She did not go to the kitchen. She stood in the service corridor for approximately 30 seconds, which was long enough to make a decision, and short enough that no one would note her absence from the room. She walked to the end of the corridor, turned left, and went to the only place available to her. She found the junior steward, a young man named Corin, who she had worked alongside for 2 years, who was responsible for the household communication chain, which was the polite institutional name for the system by which the serving staff reported problems up the chain to the head steward, who reported them to the household captain, who reported them to the king's personal guard. She found Corin in the service pantry and told him that Lord Vars appeared unwell, and that she believed there was something wrong with the wine from the toast service. That was all she said. She did not say what she had heard. She did not say what she had done. She said, a lord appeared unwell, and she believed the wine might be involved. Corin looked at her, and then looked at the door, and then looked at her again. She said it again, quietly, and with the exact tone she used when she was reporting that a tablecloth needed replacing or a floorboard had cracked. The tone of someone who was passing along a practical observation. He went. She returned to the service corridor and waited. What happened over the next 2 hours was something she learned piecemeal, in fragments, through the compressed and careful communication that traveled through the servants' corridor network, the way sound travels through stone. Imperfect, delayed, but present. Lord Vars had been assisted from the council room and taken to a physician. The physician had identified a compound in his blood that was not consistent with the wine he had consumed. The king's captain of the guard had been informed. The toast service tray had been retrieved, and the remaining wine in the goblets had been tested. One of the goblets contained the compound. One did not. The one that did not was the gold-rimmed one that had started the evening in the position assigned to the Alpha King. The one that did was currently in the position assigned to Lord Vars. The captain of the guard noted that the positions of the goblets did not match the placement record filed by the head steward 3 days prior. Someone had moved them. Linna was in the servants' common room at the back of the keep, sitting with the other servers at the end of their shift, drinking the plain tea that was left out every evening, when the captain appeared in the doorway. He was a man of approximately 50, built with the solidity of someone who had been doing physical work for all of those 50 years. He looked at the room in the way that senior guards looked at rooms, processing it entirely before stepping into it. Then he looked at Linna. She did not look away. He said her name. It was a question in only the most technical sense. She said it was her. He told her to come with him. She set down her tea. She stood. Her hands were steady. Clear's throat. The captain's name was Aldrich. She knew this. She knew most of the guard names the same way she knew the king's age, as practical operational information. He walked 3 paces ahead of her, through corridors she had cleaned and carried trays through for 4 years, and did not speak, which she understood was not hostility, but assessment. He was a man deciding what to make of her, and he was taking the walk to do it. They did not go to the guard station. They went to the East Tower. The East Tower was where the Alpha King conducted private meetings. She knew this the way she knew everything else. She had never been inside it. The room at the top of the East Tower stairs was smaller than she had expected. Stone walls with 2 high windows. A table with documents on it that she did not look at. 3 candles in a standing iron holder, burning low. 2 chairs. 1 occupied. Aldrich announced her name and stepped back through the door and closed it. Linna stood in the center of the room. Cale Marin looked at her from the chair. The thing she noticed first, the thing that she had not been able to prepare for despite 4 years of watching him from a distance, was the quality of his attention. It was not the evaluating look of a man cataloging what stood before him. It was something more particular, more directed. The look of someone who had already decided to pay close attention, and was doing so without performance. She held still under it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very directly, "You moved the goblets." Not a question. She answered him, as she had answered every version of this since it began. She said she was not certain what he was referring to. He said he was referring to the toast service tray, which, according to the steward's placement record, had been arranged in a specific sequence, and which had been found in a different sequence after the toast. She said arrangements sometimes shifted during the pre-service preparation. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Lord Vars is currently being treated for exposure to a compound that was in the wine assigned to my position." She said she was sorry to hear that. She said she hoped he recovered. He said, "I know you were behind the east curtain during the preliminary period." She said she had gone to retrieve an empty decanter from the alcove. He said, "The alcove where Lord Brennan and Lord Vars were standing." She said she had not noticed who was in the alcove. There was a silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence exactly. It was the silence of 2 people measuring one another across a short distance, and both of them knowing it. Then Cale Marin said, "I want to tell you something." He said it in a tone she had not heard from him before, quieter than the formal register, the register of the private room rather than the council table. He said, "I have been watching Brennan and Vars for 6 weeks." She did not respond. She waited. He said, "We suspected a move would be made during the signing. We did not know the mechanism. We had men watching the main access points, the kitchens, the wine storage." He paused. He said, "We did not have anyone watching the east alcove." She said nothing. He said, "The placement record of that tray was filed 3 days ago, and the record after the toast service does not match it. The position of 2 goblets was reversed." He said this without inflection, as a statement of observed fact. The way a man presents evidence he has already fully processed. She said, "I see." He said, "What I am trying to determine is whether the reversal was accidental." She said, "Things do shift during service preparation." He said, "Linna." It was the first time he had used her name, without the formal prefix. Just the name, direct, without weight or ceremony, the way a person uses a name when they want the person behind it to be present for what comes next. She stopped deflecting. She looked at him. She said, "The goblets were in the correct position when I retrieved the decanter." She said it carefully. She said, "I noticed the arrangement when I returned to the service table before the toast." He watched her. She said, "I made a correction." The room was quiet. Outside the 2 high windows, the night sky over the northern territories was the deep blue of late autumn, and there were stars visible through the stone-framed openings, the same stars that had been there every evening of her 4 years in this keep, utterly indifferent to everything happening beneath them. He said, "You heard them." She said, "I was retrieving the decanter." He said, "And you heard them." She held his gaze. She said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You understood what you heard." She said she understood that a compound had been described. She said she understood that the described goblet position matched the one assigned to him. She said she understood that the word used was 48 hours. He said, and you knew what 48 hours meant in this context. She said she worked in this keep during a political negotiation that every lord in the northern territories had an interest in the outcome of. She said understanding the context was part of her job. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully name. It was not what she had expected. She had expected cold assessment. She had expected a guard's evaluation, the particular calculating look of power, examining something unfamiliar and deciding whether it was useful or dangerous. What she saw instead was something else, something quieter and more careful. He said, "You knew that if they caught you, you would be accused of tampering with the tow service at a state signing." She said yes. He said, "You knew you had no standing to report what you heard to anyone with actual authority in that room." She said that was accurate. He said, "So you moved the goblets and told Corin the wine might be wrong and went back to work." She said she had cleared the dessert service. He said, "And your hands did not shake." She said she found hands shaking during service to be counterproductive. The corner of his mouth moved. It was a small movement, controlled, the kind that a man made when he was keeping something larger behind it. He said, "Lord Brennan is currently in the northern holding room and will be questioned in the morning." He said Vars is likely to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He said the compound has been identified and confirmed, and the connection to the Ashwick silverbark forests is already being documented. He said, "The pact stands." She said she was glad. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something directly." She said, "All right." He said, "Why did you do it?" It was not a question about loyalty or patriotism or duty. She understood that immediately. It was a real question. The question of a man who was trying to understand what was actually true about the person in front of him. She thought about it honestly before she answered. She said, "I heard what was being planned and I understood the consequence." She said, "I was in a position to change one thing." She said, "So I changed it." He said, "That's simple." She said, "It was a toast tray." He said, "Linna," she said, "I moved 2 goblets. I served 4 years in this keep. I know where the goblets go." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. He said, "Those are not the same thing, and you know it." She said nothing. He said, "You put yourself between an assassination attempt and a king you have never spoken to, and you did it with a wine tray and 4 seconds in a candlelit room, and then you went back to clearing plates." She said, "The dessert course does not clear itself." He did not suppress the reaction this time. It was brief, controlled, but it was real. The quiet sound of a man who had not expected to find something that surprised him, and had found it. Then he said, "I have a question for you." She waited. He said, "Did you know that the compound does not work on humans?" She went still. He said, "The silverbark compound suppresses the alpha neural pathway. It has no measurable effect on a human system." He said this evenly, as he had said everything else. He said, "Which means that if the goblets had remained in their original positions, and if I had drunk from the treated one, the compound would have affected me. And if by any chance the compound had ended up instead in a human server system, it would have done nothing." She said, "I did not know that." He said, "I know." He said, "It does not change what you did." He said, "I want you to understand that clearly. The action was the same regardless of that detail. She said she understood. He was quiet again. The candles had burned lower. The room had the quality of late night, the quality of the hours after significant things happen, when the significant things have already settled into fact, and what remains is the space after. He said, "Your name is Linna Voss." She said yes. He said, "You have worked here 4 years." She said yes. He said, "You have no pack." She said that was correct. He said, "Your placement record notes you as the most efficient server in the evening rotation, and the quietest." She said, "The quietest." He said, "Those are the words." He looked at her. He said, "The note also says, you correct other servers' placement errors and return them to protocol without reporting the errors to the head steward." She said she did not see the point in reporting small errors when correcting them was faster. He said, "And large errors." She said, "I moved 2 goblets." He said, "Linna." She stopped. He said, "I am going to tell you something that I need you to hear plainly." She waited. He said, "In 6 weeks of watching Brennan and Vars, with 6 of my best men working that surveillance, none of them were behind the east curtain tonight. They did not know about the toast service. They were watching the corridors they were told to watch, and they were doing it well, and it was not enough." He said this without self-recrimination and without drama, just the fact, plain, and held out for her to see. He said, "You were in the right place because you were doing your job." She said yes. He said, "And you did something with that which no one in my household with actual authority in that room thought to do." She said, "I moved 2 goblets." He said, "Stop saying that." She stopped. He looked at her directly. He said, "I have been king of these territories for 9 years. I have sat at tables with men who wanted to manage me, and men who wanted to use me, and men who wanted to replace me, and I have learned to read the room." He said, "I do not know yet what to make of you." She said that was fair. She said she did not know yet what to make of herself either. He looked at her with that particular attention again, the kind that did not feel like examination, the kind that felt like someone actually looking. He said, "What do you want?" It was not a formal question. It was not the question of a king asking a servant what their ambitions were. It was a real question, the kind that lived in the gap between what was expected and what was true. She said she had not spent much time thinking about what she wanted. He said, "Think about it now." She thought about it. She said, "I want to know that the pact actually holds." He said, "It will." She said, "And I want to know that what Brennan was planning does not have more pieces than what you caught tonight." He said, "That is what we will be finding out in the morning." She said, "Then I want to help with that." Silence. He said, "You want to help." She said she had been in the east corridor and the service pantry and the serving rotation for 4 years. She said she knew which lords visited regularly, which advisors arrived before their lords, which ones ate separately, which ones sent their own food from outside the keep. She said she knew the household at a level that the household staff knew it, which was different from the level that guards and advisors knew it. She said, "I hear things. I am very quiet, and nobody looks at me, and I hear things." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Aldrich is going to think I have lost my mind." She said she was not certain what that meant. He said, "It means that in the morning, after the questioning, I am going to ask Aldrich to bring you in again." He said it simply, without elaboration, as a statement of what would happen next. She said, "All right," he said, and I am going to ask you questions about what you have observed in 4 years of moving through this household, as though you were not there." She said she had a reasonably complete record. He said, "I know." He said, "I know because the quietest person in any room is always the one who is paying the most attention. And I should have known that earlier, and I did not. And tonight it cost me a near thing." He said this plainly, without the defensive register of a man who disliked admitting cost. She looked at him. She said, "It did not cost you anything tonight." He said, "Because of you." She said, "Because I moved 2 goblets." He said, "Linna." She said she knew. She was aware it was more than that. She had simply not yet found the version of herself that knew how to say it plainly. He said, "That is all right." He said, "You have time." She did not know what that meant yet, but she understood the tone it was said in, and she stored it, the way she stored useful things. He said, "You should sleep." He said, "Tomorrow will be a long day, and I will need you thinking clearly." She said, "I need you thinking clearly" is not a sentence she had expected to hear today. He said, "I suspect there are a number of sentences you did not expect to hear today." She said, "That is accurate." She turned to go. She was at the door when he said her name again. She stopped. He said, "The thing you said earlier, about why you did it." He said, "I want to think about that." She waited. He said, "You said you understood the consequence, and you were in a position to change one thing." He said, "I have had advisors for 9 years who fail to do that." He said it without bitterness, just the fact of it. She said she was a server. She said she had learned early that nobody else was going to steady the tray. He said, "Yes." He said, "That is exactly it." She went through the door. Aldrich was in the corridor, as she had expected, and he walked her back through the east tower, and through the main corridor, and through the servants' passage, to the household wing without speaking. At the entrance to the servants' section, he stopped and looked at her with the evaluating quality of a man who had spent 30 years deciding what was worth his attention. He said, "You moved the goblets." She said she was becoming tired of that particular sentence. He said, "Not a complaint." He said it in the flat tone that was apparently his version of something warmer. He said, "I have been captain of the guard in this keep for 12 years. She waited. He said, "I did not think to watch the east alcove." She said, "You were watching the doors." He said, "Yes." She said, "Doors are the logical place to watch." He said, "Apparently not the only place." She said nothing. He said, "Tomorrow morning." He said it as a directive, the time of the morning meeting being understood. She said she would be there. She went to the servants' quarters, and she lay down in her small bed in the room she shared with 2 other servers who were already asleep, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. She had moved 2 goblets. She had done it in 4 seconds, alone, in a room full of lords and guards, with no authority, and no protection, and no plan, except the 4 seconds themselves, and the knowledge of where the goblets were supposed to be. She had done it, because it was there to do. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the way Kael Maren had looked at her in that small stone room, not through her, the way the lords in the hall looked through every server in every room, but at her, with the full and deliberate attention of someone who had decided that the distance was no longer necessary. She thought about him saying, "You have time," and not knowing what it meant, and knowing what it meant. She slept. Clear's throat. if you want to know what happened in the morning questioning, whether Brennan confessed, what other threads he pulled on that unraveled further than anyone had expected, and what Lena Voss spent the next 6 months learning about what she was actually capable of, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next part. The story does not stop here. It is only just beginning to show its shape. Clears throat. The morning questioning took 4 hours. Aldrich conducted it with the efficient patience of a man who had done this before, and saw no value in unnecessary pressure. Brennan was not a man built for silence, and Aldrich was very good at silence. By the 2nd hour, Brennan had confirmed the compound, the supplier in the Ashwick Inner Forest, and the names of the 2 advisors from his own household who had arranged the introduction of the treated wine into the service rotation. By the 3rd hour, he had confirmed that Vars had agreed to the plan 6 weeks prior in exchange for the Eastern Coastal Amendment, which was the territorial concession that had been rejected twice in open council. By the 4th hour, he had said the name of a 3rd party, a minor lord from 2 territories north, who had bankrolled the compound extraction, and whose interest in the outcome was not territorial, but dynastic. The 3rd name was the one nobody had expected. Lena was in the antechamber during the questioning, not present in the room itself, but near enough to know the shape of what was being said. Aldrich had asked her to be there. He had not explained why in detail. She had understood that she was there in case something specific was needed, and she had sat in the antechamber chair, with her hands folded, and waited with the patience she had cultivated in 4 years of rooms, where the important things happened at other people's timing. When Aldrich emerged after the 4th hour, he looked at her and said one name. She said, "Lord Fenwick." He said, "You know him." She said she had served his table 3 times in the past 18 months, when he visited the keep. She said he had a habit of arriving before his scheduled appointment and waiting in the Eastern Gallery, where the household maps were displayed. She said his steward always asked for a private room and was always told the private rooms were for council members. She said the steward had a scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent, that came from a very specific type of blade, used only in the northern coastal trades. Aldrich looked at her. She said, "The steward wore gloves in summer, which servants do not do in summer in a stone keep, because it is already cold enough." Aldrich said, "How long have you known?" She said she had not known. She said she had observed. She said there was a difference. He said, "Is there anything else you have observed about Lord Fenwick or his household?" She said, "The last time he visited, 6 months ago, he asked me which rooms were currently occupied on the Upper East Corridor." She said she had told him the Upper East Corridor was restricted to senior household, and he had smiled and said of course, and ordered a 2nd serving of the lamb. She said, "The Upper East Corridor is where the treaty document archive is stored." Aldrich did not say anything for a moment. Then he turned and went back through the door. Lena sat in the antechamber. She folded her hands. She waited. Clears throat. She was called back into the East Tower room that afternoon. Cale Marin was standing this time, at the window with his back to her when she entered, and he turned when she came in and looked at her with the same quality of attention that she had spent the night thinking about. He said, "Fenwick." She said, "I did not know." She said, "I observed." He said, Aldrich explained the distinction. She said, "All right." He said, "The information about the archive corridor is something my senior intelligence staff did not have." She said, Your intelligence staff does not carry Lamb to the second floor. He looked at her steadily. She said she was not attempting to diminish his staff. She said there were simply things that happened in certain spaces that were only visible from certain positions. He said yes. He said it with the plainness of a man who had already accepted this and moved on to what it meant. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "Are you content?" She said she did not understand the question. He said, "In your current position, as a server." He said, "Are you content?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had thought about why she had moved the goblets. She said, "I have been useful in this position." He said, "That is not the same thing." She said, "No." He said, "What would you do if the position were different?" She said she did not know. She said she had not considered it, because it had not been a relevant consideration. He said, "Consider it now." She said, "I would observe things in better light." He said, "Meaning?" She said, "From rooms where I had permission to be paying attention, rather than rooms where I was retrieving decanters." He said, "Yes." He said it very quietly. He said, "I have an advisor who has recently been revealed to have a compromised loyalty chain that traces back to Brennan's household contacts." He said this without anger, as someone would describe a structural problem in a wall. He said, "The position will need to be filled with someone whose loyalty chain I can account for from the beginning." She said, "You cannot account for mine." She said, "You met me 12 hours ago." He said, "I have had advisors for 9 years, whose loyalty chains I could document fully, and who still failed me in ways that last night demonstrated." He said, "You moved 2 goblets with no instruction, and no authority, and no personal gain." She said, "I would not have gained anything by not moving them either." He said, "That is exactly what I mean." She looked at him. He said, "I am not offering you an advisory position today." He said, "I am not making a formal proposal of any kind today, because we have known each other for 12 hours, and I have a dynasty to protect, and a third conspirator to root, and a pact to stabilize." He said this with full awareness that he was being precise about what was and was not being said. She said, "But," he said, "but I am asking you to stay in the East Tower antechamber for the next 2 weeks, while the Fennec investigation proceeds." He said, "I am asking you to be available for questions about your 4 years of observation in this household." He said, "I am asking Aldrich to give you access to the intelligence briefings, so that the observations you have been making without a framework now have one." He said, "I want your eyes on this." She said, "I carry trays." He said, "You have been carrying the wrong things." She said nothing. He said, "Linna." She looked at him. He said, "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and I am asking you directly, and without ceremony, to let me make use of what is already inside you." She said, "That is a very large sentence for a very early stage of knowing someone." He said, "Yes." He said, "I am aware of that." She said, "I will think about it." He said, "All right." She said, "I may have more questions." He said, "I expect that." She said, "They will not be simple questions." He said, "I know." She looked at him once more, the way she had been looking at him since the night before, with the same careful and unhurried attention she gave to everything she found worth observing. Then she said, "The compound that Brennan used." He said, "Yes." She said, "You said it does not work on humans." He said, "That is correct." She said, "But you said also that Vars is being treated, that the physician identified the compound in his blood." He said, "Vars is a wolf." The compound does affect him. The 48-hour window applies to him. She said yes. She said, but Vars was not the intended target. He said no. She said, which means Vars drank the treated wine by accident. He said, by your intervention. She said yes. She said, which means Vars is now cooperating in exchange for treatment and leniency. He said, that is correct. She said, and Brennan confessed because Vars cooperated. He said, among other reasons. She said, so the compound intended to compromise you is now the mechanism that dissolved the conspiracy that deployed it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, yes. He said, that is an accurate description of the current state. She said, from 2 swapped goblets. He said, from 2 swapped goblets. She said, I find that satisfying. He said, so do I. She said she would be in the antechamber in the morning. He said, good. She went to the door. She stopped at it, because she had learned that a great deal happened at doors. She said, the roses in the east courtyard. He said, the roses. She said, they are the northern strain, the ones that bloom in the cold. She said, I have been tending the section near the service entrance for 2 years, because nobody else was doing it, and they were dying. He said, I know. She turned. He said, I noticed them 3 weeks ago. He said, I asked the head gardener, who had been caring for them, and he did not know. She said, I have been tending them in the early mornings before my shift begins. He said, without being asked. She said, they were dying. He said, yes. They looked at each other across the room. He said, come to the antechamber in the morning. She said she would. She went through the door. The corridor outside the east tower was empty and cool, and smelled of old stone, and something faintly of the coming northern winter, the particular cold that arrived 6 weeks before the snow, and settled into the walls of the keep, like a house guest who did not need to be invited. She walked through it, without hurrying. She had 4 years of observation in this household to organize, and a new framework to organize it in, and a morning that would arrive whether or not she spent the night before, it making herself small. The roses near the service entrance would need tending before the frost came. She would do that first, before the briefing. She always had. That was the thing about Linna Voss, the woman who had moved 2 goblets in 4 seconds, and changed the shape of an evening that was supposed to end differently. She did not stop doing the small work. She had never seen the small work as beneath the large work. She had seen them as the same work, approached from the same direction, with the same steadiness and the same unshaking hands. She would be in the antechamber in the morning. She would do the roses first, and the roses, tended in early mornings for 2 years by someone who had found them dying and could not see the point in walking past something she could fix, were the most thriving section of the east courtyard garden. The head gardener would not have been able to tell anyone why, but the king had asked, and now someone would. Clear's throat. That was the beginning of it, not the end. The questioning in the following weeks took the Fenwick investigation further than anyone had expected, and Linna Voss spent those weeks in the East Tower antechamber, and eventually in briefing rooms, and eventually in places that a woman with no rank, and no pack, and no name worth recording was not supposed to be. And she was in them because she was useful, and because she was steady, and because 4 years of invisibility had turned out to be 4 years of something else entirely. Lord Brennan was stripped of the Ashwick title and exiled north of the mountain boundary. Lord Vars cooperated fully and received reduced territorial penalties and a permanent advisory ban. Lord Fenwick was quietly removed from the council, and his dynastic ambitions were addressed through a combination of treaty enforcement and the particular efficiency of a captain of the guard, who had, by the end of the winter, learned to bring Linna into the morning briefings as a matter of standard procedure. Aldrich told her once, at the end of a long day, that she had the most complete mental record of the keep's operational patterns of anyone in the household, including people who had been there for 20 years. She said she had simply been paying attention. He said, "You have simply been paying attention for 4 years, in a keep full of people who stopped paying attention because they assumed someone else was doing it." She said that was an accurate assessment. He said, "You should have been in the antechamber years ago." She said she had not been asked. He said, "I know." He said it in the flat tone that was his version of an apology. The winter came. The frost came first, as it always did, 6 weeks ahead of the snow, settling into the walls of the keep and making the corridors sharp and clear. Linna learned the briefing format and the intelligence notation system and the map reference conventions and the particular shorthand that Aldrich used when he wanted something noted without it being recorded formally. She learned these things the way she had learned everything in 4 years of carrying trays, by paying attention, by being quiet, by understanding that the person who knew where the goblets were supposed to go was the person who could move them when it mattered. Cale Marin did not speak to her every day. He was a king. His days were not arranged around conversation with a woman who had recently been reassigned from the evening service rotation to the East Tower antechamber. But the conversations they did have were direct and real, and carried none of the performance that she had spent 4 years watching at formal tables. He asked her real questions and listened to the answers. She gave him real answers and noticed the listening. Once, in early winter, she came to the morning briefing with a note she had made the night before about a pattern she had observed in the visiting household records from the past 3 years. A pattern that suggested the Eastern trade delegation visits had been occurring at intervals that aligned with known movement dates for Fenwick's courier network. Aldrich looked at the note for a long time. Cale looked at it. Then he looked at her. He said, "When did you see this?" She said, 3 years ago, when the pattern started." She said, "I did not know what I was seeing." She said, "I filed it in the way I file things I do not yet have a framework for." He said, "In your memory." She said, "I have a reliable memory." He said, "Yes." He said it the way he said things that were larger than the word itself. That note opened a secondary investigation that resolved 2 questions that had been pending in the intelligence record for 18 months. Aldrich would later describe it to the king in a tone that was as close to startled as Aldrich came, as the clearest analytical connection produced in that period. The king said he was not surprised. Aldrich said, "Sir." The king said, "I moved too slowly to recognize what was in front of me." He said it plainly, the same way he said everything plainly, without the defensive quality of a man who found acknowledgement difficult. Aldrich said, "The difficulty is that what was in front of you was carrying trays." The king said, "Yes." He said, "That is the thing I intend to correct." In late winter, when the snow had arrived, and the keep was cold, and the east courtyard garden was under frost, and the roses Linna had been tending for 2 years were dormant under their careful winter mulching, Cale Marin found her in the antechamber after the day's final briefing had concluded and the other staff had gone. He sat in the chair across from her. He said, I want to tell you something, she said. All right, he said. The Ealdmar Pact was ratified by the full council last week. He said, the amended version. He said, the one without Brennan's concessions. She said she had heard. He said, it will hold for 50 years. She said she was glad. He said, I know. He said, I have been thinking about what you said, the night in the tower, what you said about why you moved the goblets. She waited. He said, you said you were in a position to change one thing. She said, yes. He said, I have been thinking about that as a description of what you have been doing here, in this keep, for 4 years before I knew your name. She said she had been carrying trays. He said, Linna. She stopped. He said, you have been in a position to change things in this household for 4 years, and you changed the ones you could reach from where you stood. He said, you corrected errors without reporting them, because correction was faster. You tended the roses because they were dying. You heard what Brennan was planning, and you moved 2 goblets, because you understood the consequence, and the goblets were within reach. He said, that is a description of someone who does not wait to be authorized to do the work. She said, I was not authorized to be in intelligence briefings either. He said, you are now. She said, yes. He said, I want to give you a formal appointment. She looked at him. He said the words for what the appointment would be, the formal title, the defined responsibilities, the standing that would come with it in the household hierarchy. She said, that is a very significant change from carrying trays. He said, it is the same work with a different frame around it. She thought about that. She said, you are the Alpha King. She said, I have no pack. He said, I know. She said, your council will have opinions. He said, my council had opinions about the Fennec investigation closing, and they were wrong about that too. She said, that is not the same category of opinion. He said, Linna. She said, I am making sure you have considered this fully. He said, I have been considering it since the night in the tower. She said, you said we had known each other 12 hours. He said, we have now known each other 12 weeks. She looked at him. He said, is that long enough for you to have an opinion about what I am asking? She said she had an opinion. He said, and, she said, it is a thorough opinion, and it requires a moment. He said, take it. She said, I spent 4 years in this keep being invisible, because I was nobody, and I had no standing and no rank, and the walls of the place I lived in were not built to have room for me in them in any other configuration. She said, and I spent 4 years observing what happened in those walls, because I was there, and paying attention, and the alternative was to stop paying attention, which I could not do. She said, and one night I moved 2 goblets because the goblets were wrong, and I was the one who knew where they were supposed to go. She said, and now you are telling me that the walls have a different configuration than I thought. He said, yes. She said, that will take some time to adjust to. He said, I know. She said, I will accept the appointment. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, good. He said it quietly, with the weight of a man who had wanted to say it, and was now saying it. She looked at him across the small space of the antechamber, which was not the East Tower room, and not the council hall, but a room in between, a threshold room. And she thought about what it meant to stand in the threshold and see both sides of it clearly. He said, walk with me. It was the first time he had said those words to her in that configuration. She understood what they meant. Not a briefing. Not a question about the intelligence record. Simply the walk itself, and the person beside him. and the morning beginning outside the windows of the keep. She stood. They walked out of the antechamber together, and through the east tower corridor, and into the open courtyard, where the winter air was cold and precise, and the dormant roses along the service entrance wall were packed with mulch against the frost. He looked at them. She said, "They will come back in the spring." She said, "The root stock is strong." She said, "The head gardener told me 3 years ago that it was too old to produce well, and I disagreed." He said, "Were you right?" She said, "Every year." He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was cold and clear, and the keep was beginning its day around them. The distant sounds of kitchens and stables and corridors coming alive. A world that was not changed, and was entirely changed. The same stone walls holding a different arrangement of things inside them. She had moved 2 goblets. She had moved them with steady hands in 4 seconds in a candlelit room, alone, with no authority, and no witness, and no plan, except the knowledge of where they were supposed to go. She had moved them because the work was there to do, and that, in the end, was everything. Not the appointment, not the briefings, not the long winter in the antechamber, or the name finally spoken plainly in a room where it echoed off stone that had stood for centuries. All of it was the same thing. A person who understood where the goblets were supposed to go. A person who moved them. A keep that was, finally, placing her accordingly. The roses would bloom in the spring. She had always known they would.